June 2006, an independent industry report named the Ford plant in Hapeville, Georgia, the single most efficient automobile assembly plant in all of North America, not a Toyota plant, not a Nissan plant. A 59-year-old Ford plant outside Atlanta, one that had been running 3 shifts a day since Harry Truman was in the White House. 4 months later, Ford shut it down. At its peak, this plant built the car that saved Ford Motor Company. The Ford Taurus, revolutionary when it launched in 1985, pulled the company back from the edge of collapse and became the best-selling car in America for 5 straight years. Nearly 7 million Tauruses were assembled here, on this floor, by these hands. On October 27, 2006, the last one rolled off the line. There was no ceremony, no speeches. The keys to a silver Taurus went to an 85-year-old man who ran a chicken sandwich restaurant across the street. Then the gates closed. How do you justify shutting down the best plant in North America? Ford had an answer. It just wasn't one the 150 workers inside ever saw coming. This is the story of a factory that did everything right and got closed anyway. A story about a car company that Ford had been in Atlanta longer than most people realized. The company first put down roots in the city in 1915 when it opened an assembly plant on Ponce de Leon Avenue, a handsome brick building that assembled Model Ts, Model As, and V8s for the growing population of the American South. For nearly 3 decades, that plant served as Ford's regional headquarters, the anchor of its southeastern operations. Then the war came. In June 1942, Ford sold the Ponce de Leon building to the U.S. War Department, and the Army Air Force took possession. The cars stopped. The plant went silent. But Ford wasn't leaving Atlanta. It was upgrading. After the war ended and the country exhaled, Ford began scouting for a new site. The American automobile industry was entering one of the great expansions in its history. Soldiers were home. Families were forming. Suburbs were spreading outward from every major city in the nation, and every family in every suburb wanted a car. Demand wasn't a question, it was a certainty. The only question was where to build. Ford chose a plot of land 8 miles south of downtown Atlanta, in a small city called Hapeville. The site sat on 82 acres, close to the railroad lines and adjacent to Atlanta's growing municipal airport, the field that would eventually become Hartsfield-Jackson, the world's busiest. The location was deliberate. Ford needed to move cars across the southeast efficiently, and Hapeville put them squarely in the middle of the region's emerging infrastructure. The new plant was designed by Albert Kahn, the same architect who had designed Ford's River Rouge complex in Michigan and dozens of the most significant industrial buildings in American history. Kahn's approach was functional and massive. 596,000 square feet of floor space under a single roof, engineered for maximum throughput, built to last. The construction cost $10 million. Henry Ford II personally traveled to Hapeville for the dedication ceremony on December 10, 1947, alongside Georgia's governor. It was not a quiet opening, it was a statement. For Hapeville itself, the plant's arrival was transformative in a way that is difficult to overstate. In 1947, Hapeville was a small southern town. Modest streets, modest ambitions, a population that had grown slowly for decades around the railroads and the airfield. It was not the kind of place that attracted major industry. Then Ford arrived, and the entire character of the city began to shift. Workers flooded in from across metro Atlanta and from counties throughout Georgia. New neighborhoods filled in around the plant's perimeter. Shops opened to serve the workers. The tax base expanded. The schools grew. One of those new businesses opened the year before the plant in 1946, directly across the street from what would become the factory's main gate. A 25-year-old entrepreneur named Truett Cathy opened a small 24-hour diner called the Dwarf Grill. He served breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And when the Ford plant opened and 3 shifts of workers began rotating through, Cathy found himself with a steady, reliable clientele at every hour of the day and night. Ford workers ate at his counter before their shifts. They ate thereafter. They brought their families on weekends. The diner did well. It would eventually become the first location of Chick-fil-A, and Truett Cathy would die a billionaire. None of that happens without the plant across the street. That is how completely Ford reshaped the geography of this small southern city. It did not just bring jobs, it created an entire ecosystem of commerce and community that hadn't existed before. In the decade following World War II, the Atlanta region added 800 new industries and 1,200 regional offices for out-of-town companies. Ford was one of the largest of them, and the Hapeville plant was among the most visible symbols of the South's post-war industrial ambitions. Georgia was not a state historically associated with automobile manufacturing. That distinction belonged to Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, the industrial heartland. The South was farmland. It was textile mills. It was tobacco. The arrival of Ford in Hapeville was part of a broader shift, a signal that the old boundaries of American industry were beginning to redraw themselves. The plant ran 3 shifts from the beginning. The first cars off the line were Ford pickup trucks, workhorses for the post-war South, practical and in demand. By 1953, the F-100 was coming off the line. By the mid-1960s, the Galaxy, the Falcon, the Fairlane 500. Each new model represented not just a different vehicle, but a different chapter in the story of post-war American life. The ranch house, the highway, the family vacation, the idea that mobility was a right and a Ford could get you there. The plant hummed, the city grew around it. And in Hapeville, Georgia, the sound of an assembly line running at full capacity came to mean something simple and durable. That the work was steady, the wages were good, and the future was not something to worry about. That feeling would last for a long time. It would not last forever. To understand what this plant meant at its height, you have to understand what it felt like to work there. In the early 1970s, the Hapeville plant employed more than 3,500 people. 3 shifts, around the clock. The building never went dark. When one crew walked out the gate at the end of their shift, another was already filing in through the same entrance. Lunch pails in hand, ready to take their places on the line. The machinery barely paused between them. The rhythm was constant. The hiss of pneumatic tools, the deep metallic clang of body panels being pressed into shape, the whir of conveyor systems moving frames from one station to the next. It was loud, physical, repetitive work. It was also, by almost any measure that working people in the post-war South cared about, exceptionally good work. A Ford assembly job in Hapeville in the 1960s and 1970s was not just employment. It was a passage into the middle class. UAW Local 8082 had been chartered since 1941, and by the time the plant reached full stride, the union had negotiated wages, pensions, and health benefits that most workers in Georgia, state with few other unionized industries of this scale, could only read about. A Ford worker in Hapeville earned wages well above the regional average. He owned a house. He had health insurance for his family. He had a pension that would pay him in retirement without needing to work until he collapsed. These were not abstractions. For men and women whose parents had sharecropped or stitched fabric in poorly lit mills for poverty wages, the Ford plant represented something that felt almost implausible. Security. Workers came from across metro Atlanta. They came from counties an hour south, an hour east. Some drove long distances every day because the job was worth it. The plant pulled people in from all of Georgia the way a large gravity does. Steady, reliable, hard to resist. And when they arrived at those gates and put on their badges and took their stations on the line, they became part of something that had its own culture, its own rhythms, its own internal world. The cars themselves tell the story of the era as clearly as anything else. In the 1960s, the plant was building the Galaxy, a full-size Ford with tail fins and chrome, the car of a country that had won a war and was spending its winnings. The Falcon followed. Ford's entry into the compact market, lighter and more economical, aimed at a new kind of buyer who was starting to think about fuel. Then the Fairlane, the Ranchero, the Torino. That muscle-era hybrid with a car body and a truck bed, a vehicle that made sense only in a decade when America seemed to believe it could have everything at once. The Mercury Cougar came off the Hapeville line in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a sleek personal luxury car that competed directly with the Pontiac Firebird and the Chevrolet Camaro, for the same young buyer who wanted speed with a hint of refinement. Each of these vehicles represents not just a production run, but an entire chapter in American consumer culture. A specific decade's specific set of desires, anxieties, and aspirations, given physical form and rolled out of a factory in a small city in Georgia. The workers who built them understood this, even if they didn't always say it in those terms. They knew they were building the cars that Americans were driving to work, loading with families for summer vacations, parking in driveways of new ranch houses in new suburbs, spreading across the country. They knew the work mattered. What does it mean for a small southern city to have a plant like this at its center? It means every other business in town is downstream from it. The diner across the street fills up at shift change. The hardware store survives on the spending of workers who own their homes. The school enrollment grows because young families move in, drawn by stable wages. Hapeville in the 1960s and 1970s was a city with an engine, a literal one, and the engine ran well. By the mid-1970s, the Hapeville plant had settled into a mature industrial stride that few facilities in the South could match. The assembly lines had been updated and reconfigured multiple times over the decades, adapting to new model platforms, new manufacturing techniques, new demands from Detroit. The plant's workforce had become multi-generational. Fathers brought their sons in when they came of age, cousins got cousins hired, families built their entire economic lives around the rhythms of a single employer. This was the deepest kind of community integration, the kind where a factory stops being a place you go to work and becomes instead the organizing principle of everything else. The UAW was the connective tissue. Local 882 negotiated not just wages, but the shape of daily life inside the plant. Shift assignments, safety standards, grievance procedures. The right to challenge a foreman's decision through a formal process that had teeth. In a region where unions were scarce and management power was historically unchecked, the existence of a functioning, well-organized local in Hapeville was itself significant. The contract workers labored under guaranteed them something that most Georgians working in non-union shops did not have: predictability. You knew what you would earn. You knew you would not be fired arbitrarily. You knew that if you gave 30 years to the line, 30 years of labor would be honored with a pension. That compact, the idea that long, loyal service would be rewarded, was not just a legal arrangement. It was a moral one. The workers of Hapeville believed in it the way people believe in things that have proven true for long enough to seem permanent. The plant also carried a deeper significance that extended beyond wages and model years. Samantha Singleton, manager of the Hapeville Depot Museum, would put it plainly decades later. The plant tells the story of 20th century America through an auto assembly floor. She was right. The hiring practices that governed Hapeville in its early years reflected the segregated South in which it operated. When the plant opened in 1947, assembly line jobs were offered to white workers. Black employees were initially confined to janitorial and service roles. The factory mirrored the society around it, a society where the law and custom of Jim Crow determined who could stand where and do what. That began to change in the 1960s as the civil rights movement pressed against every institution in the South and forced a reckoning with the structures that had been in place since before the plant's first car rolled off the line. Integration came to the Hapeville assembly floor. It came slowly and not without friction. The archive of UAW Local 882, now held at Georgia State University, contains correspondence and grievance records documenting the process in detail, the negotiations and confrontations that attended every inch of progress. But it came. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, black workers were standing on the same assembly lines as white workers, building the same cars, earning the same union wages. The plant was not a model of racial harmony by any idealized measure, but it was a place where the national story of civil rights found a local industrial expression, where the abstract became concrete, one shift at a time. By the early 1970s, the plant had reached its employment peak. More than 3,500 people on the payroll, a city within a city, a community with its own newspaper, the Atlanta Ford News, its own internal culture, its own landmarks and rituals and accumulated history. The cars were changing with every decade, But the plan itself felt solid and enduring, like something built to outlast the people who built it. It wouldn't. But that was still a long way off. For now, the lines ran, the shifts rotated, the cars moved out the gates and onto trucks headed across the southeast. And in Hapeville, Georgia, the sound of a factory at full capacity was the sound of a city that believed in its own future. To understand why the closing of the Hapeville plant matters, you first have to understand what the Ford Taurus was and what it did. By the late 1970s, Ford Motor Company was in serious trouble. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 had exposed the fundamental weakness of the American auto industry's strategy, building large, heavy, fuel-hungry cars in a world that was rapidly losing its appetite for them. Japanese manufacturers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, had been steadily building their American market share through the decade, offering smaller, more reliable, more fuel-efficient vehicles at competitive prices. American buyers were listening. Ford's response for most of the 1970s was inadequate. The product line was aging. Quality was inconsistent. The design philosophy was conservative to the point of stagnation. Between 1979 and 1982, Ford lost $3 billion. In the early 1980s, that was a sum large enough to threaten the existence of the company itself. Ford's market share fell below 20% for the first time in the company's modern history. The executive suite was in turmoil. Lee Iacocca, Ford's best marketing mind, had been forced out and gone to Chrysler, where he would engineer his own comeback story. The mood inside Ford was not panic exactly, but something close to it, the recognition that the company was running out of time to do something different. In the spring of 1980, Ford chairman Philip Caldwell authorized a project that would define the decade. He assembled a team, engineers, designers, marketers, manufacturing experts, and gave them a single mandate: build a car that could compete with the best midsize vehicles in the world, domestic or foreign. The team was led by a vice president named Louis Veraldi, and it came to be known simply as Team Taurus. What Veraldi's team did was radical for Detroit in 1980. Instead of handing the project to engineers and letting designers follow behind, they integrated every discipline from the beginning. Marketing sat alongside engineering. Manufacturing weighed in before a single body panel was finalized. The goal was not just a better car, it was a better process. Ford had spent years building vehicles that were the product of fragmented, siloed departments working in sequence rather than collaboration. Team Taurus would be different. The car they built was different too. The first-generation Taurus launched on December 26, 1985 as a 1986 model. Its exterior was unlike anything American automakers had been producing. Where competitors offered boxy, upright profiles shaped by habit and conservative market research, the Taurus was curved, aerodynamic, rounded, what journalists immediately nicknamed the jelly bean. No grille, flush headlights, doors that flowed up into the roofline, a drag coefficient of 0.32, exceptional for an American sedan of its era. Motor Trend tested pre-production models and called it the shape of tomorrow. Popular mechanics praised it as a totally new breed of car. Ford's own executives were not entirely confident it would sell. The Edsel was still a cautionary memory, the story of a company that had tried too hard to be different and paid the price in humiliating public rejection. Ford hedged its bet by keeping the old LTD in production alongside the Taurus through the 1986 model year, just in case. If the Taurus failed, the company would almost certainly have been forced to file for bankruptcy. The investment in development and tooling had exceeded $3 billion. This was not a calculated risk so much as a bet-the-company moment dressed in corporate language to look like strategy. The Taurus did not fail. Over 200,000 Tauruses sold in the first model year alone. It won Motor Trend's Car of the Year for 1986. It appeared on Car and Driver's 10 Best list. More significantly, it pulled buyers back to Ford who had been defecting to Japanese brands for years. People who had told themselves they would never again buy an American car and then found themselves in a Taurus showroom, genuinely surprised. By 1988, the Taurus was the best-selling car in America. By 1992, it had reclaimed that title after a brief interruption and held it for 5 straight years, through 1996. Ford sold nearly 400,000 Tauruses in 1994 alone. The car that everyone inside Chrysler had predicted would fail had instead triggered a design revolution across the entire industry. General Motors and Chrysler both scrambled to develop aerodynamic competitors. The Jelly Bean had won. The Hapeville plant was not where the first Taurus came off the line. That distinction went to the Chicago assembly plant, which produced the sedans beginning in late 1985. Atlanta began building the Taurus wagon in 1986, and as production ramped up across both facilities, became one of the two primary assembly points for the model's entire run. For the workers at Hapeville, the arrival of the Taurus on their line was a transformation. The cars they had been building, the Granada, the LTD, the Mercury Marquis, were aging products from a fading era. The Taurus was different. It felt like working on something that mattered, something that had the company's full energy behind it. And for a time it did. The late 1980s and early 1990s were years of genuine momentum at Hapeville. The plant had been retooled to accommodate the Taurus's front-wheel drive platform and the more sophisticated manufacturing demands of its unibody construction. Automated welding systems had been brought in. The workforce was being trained on processes derived directly from the quality culture that Ford had built around the car. The statistical controls, the emphasis on precision over speed. The plant was modernizing not because anyone demanded it, but because the Taurus required it, and the workers of Hapeville responded. Production figures at the plant peaked in this period. The Taurus and its Mercury twin, the Sable, were coming off the Hapeville line in numbers that filled the plant to capacity. Workers pulled overtime. The union negotiated from a position of strength because the labor at Hapeville was delivering product that the company needed. The relationship between the plant and Ford corporate, which can be strained even in the best of times, the distance between Hapeville and Dearborn being not merely geographic, felt for this period like something close to alignment. The plant was building what the company needed. The company was investing in the plant that was building it. What does it feel like when a factory is running well, when every shift ends on target, when quality numbers are trending right, when the car you're assembling is the one your neighbors are buying? The workers of Hapeville in the early 1990s knew that feeling. They had something to be proud of. Their plant, in a region of the country not known for heavy industry, was assembling the best-selling car in the United States. That was not a small thing. But even at the peak, the first hairline cracks were forming. Invisible at the time, obvious only in retrospect. Ford's success with the Taurus had the paradoxical effect of making the company complacent about it. The car was selling. The profits were reliable. And in the mid-1990s, something else was selling even better: trucks. The Ford F-Series had long been the company's most profitable product, but the explosion of the SUV market in the 1990s changed the calculus entirely. The Ford Explorer, launched in 1990, became a cultural phenomenon. Not just a vehicle, but a category. The invention of a lifestyle accessory that millions of American families decided they could not live without. The profit margins on SUVs and trucks dwarf those on mid-size sedans. Every dollar Ford directed toward developing the next Expedition or the next Explorer was a dollar not going into updating the Taurus. The updates the Taurus did receive in the mid-1990s were cosmetic rather than fundamental. A 1996 redesign softened the edges of the original Jelly Bean shape, but did nothing to address the car's aging mechanical architecture or its growing distance from the Japanese competition that had been gaining ground steadily since 1997, when the Toyota Camry surpassed the Taurus to become America's best-selling car. Ford's response to losing the top spot was not to reinvest in the Taurus. It was to shrug. The company was making money on trucks. The sedan could wait. It waited too long. And on the floor of the Hapeville plant, among workers who had given years of their lives to building the car that had saved the company, the wait would eventually cost everything. The Hapeville plant was not only a factory, it was a social institution. And like every social institution in the American South in the years after World War II, it carried within it the full weight of the society that had built it. When the plant opened its doors on December 1st, 1947, the South was still governed by Jim Crow. Segregation was not merely custom. It was law enforced by statute and by violence. woven into every aspect of public and private life, from the water fountains in courthouse lobbies to the bleachers at high school football games. Georgia in 1947 was a state where a black man could not sit at the same lunch counter as a white man, could not share a hospital ward, could not vote without risking his life. The Ford plant in Hapeville was embedded in that world. It did not stand apart from it. The hiring practices that governed the plant in its early years reflected that reality without apology. Assembly floor jobs, the positions that carried UAW wages, benefits, and the pathway to a middle-class life, were offered to white workers. Black employees were directed toward custodial and service roles. They maintained the building, cleaned the floors, managed the waste streams of a factory running 3 shifts around the clock. They were inside the plant, but not on the line. The wages and protections that the union contract guaranteed were, in this period, largely not available to them. The architecture of opportunity had a color line drawn through it. This was not unique to Hapeville. It was the condition of industrial employment across the South and in different forms across much of the North. Ford's history with black workers was complicated and contradictory. The company had employed black workers at its River Rouge complex in Michigan in significant numbers since the 1920s, though often in the most dangerous and physically punishing assignments. In the South, in a plant opened in the year of Truman's integration order for the military, the local customs proved stronger than any national policy Ford might have articulated from Dearborn. What made Hapeville eventually different was the movement that arrived at its gates. Atlanta in the late 1950s and into the 1960s was one of the most consequential cities in America. Martin Luther King Jr. had been born there. The city's historically black colleges and universities, Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, were producing a generation of activists and organizers who understood that the law could be changed, that segregation could be dismantled, and that the method was direct, nonviolent confrontation with the structures that sustained it. In 1960, student sit-ins at downtown Atlanta lunch counters drew national attention. King was arrested. The national press descended. The pressure that the civil rights movement applied to every institution in the South reached the Hapeville plant as it reached every institution. The question of who could stand on an assembly line, who could earn a union wage building cars, was not a question that could remain frozen forever against the tide of what was happening in the streets of Atlanta, in the courtrooms, and in the halls of Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made employment discrimination on the basis of race a federal violation. The law changed the formal structure of what was permissible. The reality inside workplaces changed more slowly and not without resistance. At Hapeville, the integration of the assembly floor came in stages through the 1960s, and it was contested at every step. The UAW Local 882 archive at Georgia State University, one of the richest collections of labor history in the South, holds the documentation of that process. Grievance filings, correspondence, union resolutions. The records show a workplace working through one of the most difficult social transitions in American history, one shift at a time. Black workers moved from custodial roles to production positions. Seniority rules that had been used to maintain informal segregation were challenged and renegotiated. The floor changed. It did not change easily, or all at once, or without the kind of friction that leaves marks in the historical record. But the Hapeville Depot Museum's curator, Samantha Singleton, put it plainly. The plant tells the story of 20th century America through an assembly floor. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, black workers were standing at the same stations as white workers, building the same cars, drawing the same union paychecks. The abstract promise of equal opportunity had found a concrete industrial expression. In Hapeville, Georgia, a small city in the Deep South, that was not nothing. It was in fact remarkable. The integration of the Hapeville floor did not resolve the tensions inside the plant. It transformed them. The battleground shifted from who could work there to the conditions under which everyone worked. The relationship between UAW Local 882 and Ford management was, across the plant's history, a negotiated adversarialism. Each side understood that it needed the other. Ford needed the labor. The workers needed the wages. The union existed as the mechanism by which the terms of that mutual dependence were argued out formalized, and enforced. In the decades before the Taurus arrived, those negotiations had produced a contract that workers in Hapeville regarded as the foundation of everything they had built. The wages, the health insurance, the pension, the grievance process that gave a worker on the floor some protection against arbitrary management decisions. But a contract is only as strong as management's willingness to operate within it. And inside the plant, the pressure that management applied to the line, the constant push for higher output, for faster cycle times, for more vehicles per shift, was a source of permanent friction. Speed up, in the vocabulary of the assembly floor, was the enemy. Every worker knew what it meant. More cars per hour, the same number of people, the same number of hands, bodies wearing out faster, injuries accumulating, the pace set by the line leaving no margin for human variation, for a moment's hesitation, for the small adjustments that distinguish work from punishment. That tension erupted most visibly in 1986, the same year the Taurus arrived on the Hapeville line. Workers at the plant staged a significant work stoppage, walking off the job in protest over what they described as an accelerated assembly line speed that management had pushed through without adequate negotiation. Roughly 3,000 workers participated. The action halted production for weeks, costing Ford thousands of vehicles in output at the precise moment the company was trying to ramp up its most important new model. The 1986 stoppage was not a strike over wages, it was a strike over the human cost of speed. Over the question of how fast a body can move for 8 hours and still go home intact. The workers won enough of what they needed to return to work. The line speed issue was addressed, the contract language tightened. But the underlying tension never disappeared. It lived in the plant the way old arguments live in a household. Never fully settled, always capable of resurging when pressure is applied. For the next 2 decades, the workers of Hapeville built Tauruses at a pace that they and the union had negotiated. They built them well. They built them efficiently. The harbor reports of the late 1990s and early 2000s would consistently rank the plant among the most productive in North America, precisely because the workforce had developed an institutional knowledge, a collective expertise that came from decades of doing the same work and doing it together. What does that kind of expertise look like from the outside? It looks like an efficiency number. It looks like 15.37 hours per vehicle, the figure Harbor Consulting attached to the Hapeville plant in 2006. But from the inside, from the perspective of the workers who produced that number, it looked different. It looked like a foreman who trusted his crew because they had been building cars together for 15 years. It looked like a quality control process that workers had helped design because they understood the line better than anyone in Dearborn ever could. It looked like the accumulated labor of people who had decided, despite everything the plant's history contained, despite the segregation that had marked its founding and the speed-up battles that had marked its middle years, to invest themselves fully in the work. The workers of Hapeville were not naive. They understood that a factory is not a family, that a corporation is not loyal, that the relationship between management and labor is transactional at its core. The union existed precisely because they understood this, but they had also built something real on that floor. A community of practice, a shared competence, a way of working together that had produced, by any objective measure, the best auto assembly operation on the continent. That made what came next not just an economic event, it made it a betrayal. The decline of the Taurus did not happen overnight. It happened gradually across nearly a decade through a series of decisions made in Dearborn that the workers in Hapeville could see coming but could do nothing to stop. The first signal arrived in 1996, though few recognized it as a warning at the time. That year, Ford managed to retain the Taurus's title as best-selling car in America, but only by flooding the rental car market. Of all Taurus units sold in 1996, only 49% went to private retail customers. The rest went to Hertz, Avis, Enterprise, corporate fleets, airport counters. The car that had once been the aspirational choice of American families was being propped up by bulk fleet contracts. When a car exists primarily in rental lots and airport parking garages, something has already gone wrong. Consumers who had once driven Tauruses by choice were choosing the Camry and the Accord instead. The numbers still looked good. The story behind the numbers did not. In 1997, the Toyota Camry surpassed the Taurus to become America's best-selling car. Ford's response was revealing. Rather than treating the loss as an emergency, rather than pouring resources into a fundamental redesign that could close the gap, the company produced a third-generation Taurus that addressed the wrong problem entirely. The 1996 redesign had already pushed the jelly bean aesthetic past the point of consumer acceptance, making the car too aggressively rounded, too visually strange for mainstream tastes. The interior adopted an all-oval design theme, applied to every surface including the instrument panel, that automotive journalists and buyers found disorienting rather than futuristic. Ford had taken a design language that had been genuinely revolutionary in 1985 and kept pushing it in the same direction until it tipped into parody. When the fourth generation arrived in 2000, Ford pulled the design back toward conservatism. Flatter surfaces, more upright trunk, squarer interior. But the correction came too late and aimed at the wrong target. The car's fundamental problem was not that it looked too bold. The problem was that Ford had not invested in making it genuinely competitive with the Camry and Accord in the ways that buyers in the late 1990s and early 2000s actually cared about: reliability data, fuel efficiency, ride quality, interior refinement. The Japanese manufacturers had been quietly improving their vehicles every model year, building on their reputations with incremental but consistent upgrades. Ford had been spending its money elsewhere. Where? On trucks, on SUVs, on the Ford Explorer, which had become a cultural phenomenon when it launched in 1990 and had spawned an entire category of vehicle. On the Expedition, the Excursion, the F-150, which had been generating enormous profit margins for years. The mid-1990s and early 2000s were a period of spectacular profitability for Ford's truck and SUV division, and those profits obscured the structural weakness that was accumulating underneath. Every engineering dollar spent on the next SUV was a dollar not spent on keeping the Taurus competitive. Every marketing campaign aimed at truck buyers was a campaign not making the case for the sedan. A USA Today editorial written in the final weeks of the Taurus's life put it plainly in its headline, "How Ford Starved Its Taurus." That starvation was a choice. It was not forced by market conditions. It was made in boardrooms by executives who believed, correctly in the short term, that the money was in trucks. What they failed to account for was the cost of abandoning the product that had rebuilt the company's reputation for quality and innovation. And they failed to account for what that abandonment would eventually mean for the plant in Hapeville that had given 20 years of its life to building it. On January 23, 2006, Ford Motor Company held a press conference in Dearborn, Michigan. The company's chairman, Bill Ford, great-grandson of Henry Ford, stepped to the podium and announced what the company was calling the way forward. The plan was sweeping: close 14 manufacturing facilities across North America, eliminate between 25 and 30,000 jobs, reduce assembly capacity by more than a quarter. The goal was to reverse the $1.6 billion loss Ford had posted in its North American operations in 2005 alone, the beginning of what would become a far deeper financial crisis before it was resolved. The Hapeville plant was on the closure list. S.L. Stevens, president of UAW Local 882, described the announcement as a shock. The plant had been ranked consistently among the top-performing assembly operations in North America. It had met every production target Ford had set for it. Its workers had absorbed multiple model transitions, retooled their methods, invested in the quality culture that the Taurus had demanded. And now, without warning or prior negotiation, their plant had been placed on a list of facilities deemed expendable. The logic Ford used to justify the closure was not, on its face, irrational. The company was carrying excess capacity. Its plants were running at only 79% of potential output, while Japanese competitors were operating at 94 to 106%. Closing underutilized facilities was standard restructuring doctrine. Ford also cited the aging infrastructure of the Hapeville plant, built in 1947, nearly 60 years old, as a factor in the decision. But here the geography of the decision revealed something important. Ford had, in fact, explored whether the Hapeville plant could be expanded or modernized to remain viable. The answer was no. And the reason was not the plant itself. The plant was hemmed in on all sides. To the east, Interstate 75. To the west and south, the flight paths and FAA height restrictions of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, which had grown from the modest municipal airfield next door in 1947 into the world's busiest airport. The plant could not grow vertically because of the flight corridors overhead. It could not expand horizontally because the highway had long since occupied the surrounding land. The plant that had been strategically situated in 1947, close to infrastructure, close to transportation, had been physically trapped by the growth of that same infrastructure over 6 decades. It had nowhere left to go. What Ford did not say, and what its own president of the Americas, Mark Fields, had the candor to acknowledge, was that the company's inability to keep the Taurus competitive had been a self-inflicted wound. Fields, who had not been at Ford when the key decisions about the Taurus were made, told reporters plainly that he couldn't understand how the company had strayed so far from the car that had saved it. Ford CEO Alan Mulally, who arrived in September 2006 to replace Bill Ford in the top role, was equally blunt. The decision to discontinue the Taurus and replace it with the anonymously named 500 had been a mistake. The 500 should simply have been called the Taurus from the beginning. The brand name still carried power. Ford had thrown it away. None of this analysis helped the workers of Hapeville. The plant's fate had been decided in January. The Taurus's last production run was already being wound down. By early 2006, the line was building out the final orders. A short 2006 model year run of sedans being sold exclusively to fleet customers, since retail sales had already been halted. The workers who had spent years building a car that America had loved were now building its last batch for rental agencies. The indignity of that sequence, from best-selling car in America to airport rental lot, was not lost on anyone on the floor. Earl Chaffim, a 22-year electrician who repaired the welding robots that had become essential to the plant's efficiency, spoke for many when he described the anger that had settled over the workforce after the closure announcement. The plant had won awards. The plant had hit its numbers. The plant had done everything that was asked of it. The problem was never in Hapeville. The problem was the decisions made in Dearborn about a product that the people in Hapeville had no power to protect. That asymmetry between the workers who had delivered and the executives who had decided is the moral center of what happened here. A factory is not a person, but the people inside one are. And when the people responsible for a company's strategy drive that strategy off a cliff and then hand the workers a bill for the crash, something more than a business decision has occurred. Ray Daniels, a 33-year veteran of the plant, put it in 11 words. If they'd kept the name, we'd still be here. He was probably right. The announcement on January 23, 2006 changed everything inside the plant. Not because the workers stopped working, but because they kept working. That is the particular cruelty of a plant that receives a closure notice months in advance. The line keeps running, the shifts keep rotating, the badges keep getting swiped at the gate each morning, but the meaning of all of it has quietly changed. You are no longer building toward something. You are counting down toward nothing. Mark Gilmore, who had transferred to Hapeville from a Ford plant in Ohio just the year before, believing he said that Georgia would be a more stable posting, described the mood on the factory floor on the day the announcement came. He was sitting in the offices of UAW Local 882 when he spoke to a reporter. His voice was flat. It's like when you walk in, it's like somebody died and everyone knows the same person, he said. A lot of bitterness. The morale is at an all-time low. Gilmore had 11 years with Ford. He was not the worst positioned worker in the building that day. The workers who were worst positioned were the ones who had 25-30 years on the line. The ones whose entire adult lives had been organized around this plant, this contract, this particular sequence of shifts and paychecks, and the accumulated expertise of doing one thing very well for a very long time. For those workers, the announcement was not just a job loss. It was the dismantling of an identity. Wilburn Kelly, a shipping clerk with 38 years at Hapeville, told reporters as he walked out of the plant at noon that day that he expected to retire. But he was thinking about his co-workers who hadn't reached that threshold. It will be rough, he said. He was understating it. The 9 months that followed were unlike anything the plant had experienced before. Ford had offered a menu of 8 separation packages: buyouts, early retirement incentives, educational benefits, transfer options. Workers over 55 with 30 years of service could claim a $35,000 bonus to retire early. Younger workers who accepted buyouts could receive up to $140,000 in severance in exchange for releasing all future benefit claims. The packages were, by the standards of the industry and the era, relatively generous. They were also structurally the company's way of making the closure feel like a personal decision rather than an institutional one, of turning a collective loss into a series of individual transactions that each worker had to navigate alone. The transfers were difficult. Ford was offering positions at its plant in Louisville, Kentucky, a facility more than 400 miles north in a different state, a different climate, a different city. For workers who had built their lives in metro Atlanta, who owned homes in Griffin, in Jonesboro, in College Park, in neighborhoods strung along the interstate corridor south of the airport, the question of uprooting and moving to Kentucky was not a simple one. Laura Darcy, 43 years old, who lived in Griffin about an hour south of Hapeville, decided she would stay in Georgia. Between 300 and 400 workers ultimately accepted the Louisville transfer. The rest faced the buyout packages, the early retirements, or the open labor market of a mid-2000s Atlanta economy that had no shortage of service jobs and a shortage of anything that paid what Ford had paid. The quality of the work did not deteriorate. That is something worth noting. Plant manager Dale Wisniewski said explicitly in the weeks before the closure that workers had actually raised quality levels after the announcement. A workforce that had been told their plant was dying continued to build cars to the highest standard they knew. There is something in that fact, in the deliberate, practiced dignity of it, that resists easy explanation. Perhaps it was professional pride. Perhaps it was a refusal to let the plant's final record be anything less than what they had always produced. Whatever the reason, the Hapeville plant went out doing its job correctly. 3 people carry this chapter's story from the announcement to the final day. Each represents a different version of the same loss. Earl Chafim had spent 22 years at Hapeville as an electrician, not on the assembly line itself, but in the infrastructure that kept the line running. He repaired the welding robots. He maintained the automated systems that had been central to the plant's efficiency achievements. He knew every machine in the building in the way that a surgeon knows anatomy, not as a set of diagrams, but as a living, specific, frequently unpredictable reality that he had been diagnosing and fixing for more than 2 decades. When the closure was announced, Chafim did not go quiet. He was one of the workers who spoke to reporters directly, and what he said went to the heart of the injustice. The plant had been named the most productive assembly facility in North America, and it was being closed anyway. The awards were real, the numbers were real, the performance was real, none of it was enough. The biggest part I hate, he told the Associated Press in October 2006, is we got the #1 selling car in the company. We won so many awards for being #1. It's a shame. We're still outselling other cars, and we're not even taking orders anymore. That last phrase lands with particular force. The plant was still building cars that were selling. Ford had simply decided to stop taking orders. The decision was not driven by the failure of the people or the machinery in Hapeville. It was driven by decisions made far above them, in rooms they had no access to, about products they had no control over. Ray Daniels had 33 years at the plant. He had started there when the Torino was on the line, when Richard Nixon was president, when the plant's workforce had not yet fully recovered from the wounds of the civil rights battles that had been fought on its floor. He had watched the plant change, the models cycling through, the automation arriving, the integration of the workforce completing itself over years rather than days. He had watched the Taurus arrive in 1986 and had understood immediately that it was different from the LTD and the Marquis that had preceded it. He had watched the Taurus become the best-selling car in America and had taken some measure of pride in the fact that his hands and his colleagues' hands were part of what made that possible. Daniels gave his assessment of what had gone wrong in a single sentence, the kind of sentence that contains a whole argument. If they'd kept the name, we'd still be here. He was talking about the Taurus name, the decision to replace it with the anonymous 500, rather than invest in a redesign and a rebrand that would have maintained the equity the nameplate had built over 20 years. He was right. Ford's own CEO acknowledged it a year later. But by then, the plant was already gone. Laura Darcy was 43 years old and lived in Griffin, Georgia, an hour south. She was not a long-tenure worker with a pension on the horizon. She was mid-career, mid-life, facing the prospect of an Atlanta job market that would not match what she had earned at Ford. She decided she would stay in Georgia rather than follow the transfer to Louisville. That decision, to stay, to rebuild from where you are rather than uproot and follow the company that had just told you it no longer needed you, was the decision made by the majority of the 11950 workers who closed the gate behind them in October 2006. What does it feel like to drive to work at a plant you know is closing? To swipe your badge at a gate you know will be locked to you in a matter of weeks? To build a car that the company has already decided to stop selling? The workers of Hapeville answered that question with their attendance records and their quality scores. They showed up. They did the work. They did it well. And then they walked out of those gates for the last time, carrying whatever version of a future they had managed to assemble for themselves from the pieces Ford had left them. The weather on the morning of October 27, 2006 was cold and rainy. The workers who drove to the Hapeville plant for the last time said afterward that it felt appropriate. They had been arriving at this gate for years, some for 3 decades, some for 2, some for just a few, moving through the same routines of shift change that had structured their lives the way seasons structure a year. Badge swipe, time clock, station. The rhythm of it had become so familiar that it had stopped feeling like a routine and had become simply the texture of daily existence. On this particular Friday morning, the rhythm was the same, but everyone knew it was the last time. The plant had started the day's production before dawn. The final shift was not dramatic by design. There was no announcement over the intercom. No gathering of management at the front of the floor. No speech. Plant manager Dale Wisnowski had said the week before that when the lights went out, there would be no ceremony. It's not a reason for celebration, he had told reporters. He was right. What was there to celebrate? The plant was closing. The people inside it were losing the jobs they had worked and negotiated, and in some cases, fought for over the course of adult lifetimes. What was happening instead was quieter than a ceremony and more permanent. The line was running. The last cars were being assembled. The last welds were being laid. The last quality checks were being made by workers who, even now, were doing their jobs with the same precision they had always brought, because that was what they knew how to do, and because to do anything less would have felt like a betrayal of what the plant had been. Sometime around 7 in the morning, the last Ford Taurus completed its journey down the Hapeville assembly line. It was silver, a 4-door sedan assembled under the specifications for the 2006 model year. The final short run of fleet vehicles that Ford had approved before pulling the plug on retail sales entirely. It was, by any external measure, an ordinary car. Nothing distinguished it from the hundreds of thousands of Tauruses that had preceded it down this line over 21 years, except the fact that it was last. Before it left the floor, the workers did something that had not been announced or planned by management. They signed it. Under the hood and across the trunk lid, the men and women of the Hapeville plant wrote their names on the metal of the final car they would ever build in this building. It was an act with no corporate sanction and no practical purpose. It was an act of ownership, of insisting that the work that had been done here by these people over all these years be acknowledged by someone, even if only by themselves and by the 85-year-old man across the street who was waiting to receive it. That man was Truett Cathy. Cathy had opened his first restaurant, the Dwarf Grill, in 1946, the year before the Ford plant opened across the street. He had built his entire business on the foot traffic of Ford workers coming off shift, hungry at 2 in the morning, hungry at 6, hungry at noon. He had tested his chicken sandwich recipe on them in 1961, asking the workers who came in to tell him honestly whether it was any good. They had told him it was. Chick-fil-A existed, in some meaningful sense, because of the plant across the street. By 2006, Cathy was a billionaire. He had not forgotten where he had come from. He stood at the end of the assembly line that morning to greet the last car as it reached completion. He received the keys from plant manager Wisniewski and Ford representative Al Kent. He spoke at the Dwarf House afterward, looking across the street at the building he had spent 60 years watching. I received it with mixed emotion, he said, then with the self-awareness of a man who had lived long enough to understand irony. I was very sorry the workers at the Ford plant lost their jobs, but since I was going to get the keys, I was glad for that. The silver Taurus was taken to Chick-fil-A's corporate headquarters in Atlanta, where Kathy added it to a collection that included 19 other vehicles. Among them, one of the earliest Fords ever built, the first Ford and the last Taurus from Hapeville. Joined together in a private museum, the circle had closed. The rest of the day unfolded in the particular slow register of endings that have already been decided. There were no speeches on the floor, no gathered crowds, no final toast in the break room. The plant had run 3 shifts a day since Harry Truman was in the White House, had kept its lines moving through recessions and oil shocks, and the upheavals of the civil rights era, and the arrival of Japanese competition, and the birth and death and revival of the car it would become most famous for building. On this day, it ran its last shift with the same absence of ceremony that had characterized every other shift. The machinery completed what it was set to complete. The workers completed what they were assigned to complete. Then they clocked out. John Rape, a worker from Zebulon, Georgia, stood outside the plant after his final shift and spoke to a reporter. He was trying to explain what had not yet registered. "It hasn't sunk in yet," he said. "Wait until Monday morning when I wake up and don't have anywhere to go." That sentence contains the entire experience of a plant closure compressed into 17 words, not the economics of it, not the policy of it, the Monday morning of it, the alarm that goes off out of habit, the moment before full consciousness when the body still remembers the routine and the mind has not yet caught up with the fact that the routine is over. The particular silence of a morning that should be full of the sounds of preparation, the shower, the coffee, the drive south on 75, but is instead just quiet. By the end of the day, 1,950 workers had left the building for the last time. The gates were secured. The machinery inside went cold and still. The lights, which had burned around the clock for 59 years, were turned off. What had been built here, across those 59 years, was larger than any single car model or any single decade of production. The Hapeville plant had assembled more than 8 million vehicles. It had employed multiple generations of the same families. It had been the economic foundation of a small southern city. It had been a battleground and a proving ground for the civil rights of the workers who built it. It had won awards. It had produced strikes. It had been retooled and modernized and pushed to efficiency levels that impressed even the Japanese manufacturers who were widely considered to have invented modern automotive production. And it had produced, across 21 years, the car that its parent company had needed most at its moment of greatest vulnerability. The Taurus had saved Ford in 1985. The workers of Hapeville had built the Taurus, and Ford had thanked them by closing the plant in the same year it was named the best in North America. The plant itself had no voice in any of this. Buildings do not have opinions, but the workers did, and they had expressed those opinions through their quality scores and their attendance records and their signatures on the inside of a trunk lid on the morning of October 27, 2006. They had said in the only language available to them, "We were here, we did the work, we did it well. The record exists." Dale Wisniewski, who had managed those workers and that plant through its final year, had been right about the tears. There had already been tears before that Friday. There were more on the day itself. There is no clean way for a community to absorb the loss of the thing that organized it. There is no paperwork that makes it manageable. There is only time and the long, slow work of figuring out what comes next without the anchor that held everything in place. The last Ford Taurus had left the building. The first Ford Taurus, assembled in Hapeville, had rolled off this same line in 1986. Between those two moments, 20 years, 7 million cars, an American story about what manufacturing could be and what happened when the people responsible for it made the wrong choices, lay the full weight of what had been lost. The rain kept falling on Hapeville. The plant sat still. For the first time in 59 years, there was nothing left to build. The plant sat empty for nearly 2 years. Ford had secured the gates in October 2006. The machinery inside went through auction. The welding robots that Earl Shafim had spent 22 years maintaining, the conveyor systems, the automated paint lines, sold off piece by piece, shipped to other facilities, or scrapped. The building itself, 2.8 million square feet of industrial floor space, still stood. But the thing that had given it meaning was gone. In June 2008, Ford sold the 122-acre site to Jacoby Development for just over $40 million. Demolition began in August of that year. A contractor called D.H. Griffin Wrecking Co. began systematically taking apart the building that Albert Kahn had designed for Henry Ford II in 1946. The same building dedicated by the governor of Georgia in December 1947. The same building that had never gone dark in nearly 60 years. It took about a year. By August 2009, the site was cleared. Nothing remained except bare ground, a chain-link fence, and the faint chemical contamination from decades of automotive production, solvents, paint waste, asbestos, that would require extensive environmental remediation before the land could be used for anything new. Before the building came down, workers in hazmat gear removed 80,000 square feet of floor tile containing asbestos, stripped 65,000 linear feet of duct insulation, pulled mercury-containing fixtures from every room. The decontamination took months. The plant had been operating since 1947 on industrial processes that were standard for their era and toxic by later standards. The ground that had supported 8 million cars needed to be cleaned before it could support anything else. Jacoby had plans. The developer called the project Aerotropolis Atlanta, a $1.5 billion mixed-use development envisioned as a city within a city positioned to capitalize on the proximity of Hartsfield-Jackson. Office towers, retail, a hotel, residential units. The concept was ambitious, and the site's location, wedged between Interstate 75 and the world's busiest airport, was genuinely unusual. But for years after the demolition, the site sat largely vacant. The ambitious plans moved slowly. The land that had housed Ford's most productive assembly plant became, for a time, one of the most prominent undeveloped lots in metro Atlanta. A gash, as one journalist put it, along one of downtown Hapeville's main corridors. What eventually came was not the full Aerotropolis vision, but something more concentrated and symbolically harder to ignore. In May 2011, Porsche Cars North America announced it would move its United States headquarters from a suburb north of Atlanta to the old Ford plant site. The investment would total $100 million. The complex would include a 220,000 square foot headquarters building, a technical training center, and a Porsche Experience Center built around a 1.6-mile test track. Porsche opened its facility in 2015. It employs around 400 people. Its test track sits on ground where American workers once built American cars for American families at wages that put them in the middle class. The irony is not subtle. Where Ford built Tauruses and Falcons and Torinos for 6 decades, a German luxury brand now runs its North American operations. Where a unionized workforce of nearly 2,000 people once assembled the best-selling car in the country, a flagship European automaker showcases vehicles that start at 6 figures on a track, open to paying customers who want to experience what their Porsche can do. Hapeville Mayor Alan Hallman, who had called the Ford closure an economically devastating event, welcomed the Porsche announcement with the pragmatism of a civic leader who understood that the alternative was continued vacancy. The stars had aligned, he said. He was probably right. But it is worth sitting with what the alignment means. The American manufacturing economy of the mid-20th century, replaced by the service and luxury economy of the early 21st, on the same ground in the same small southern city. The Hapeville Depot Museum has tried to hold the memory. In 2024, it launched an exhibit titled Civil Rights and Workers' Rights, an exhibition of Hapeville's Atlanta assembly plant. The exhibit includes oral histories from former workers, old uniforms, commemorative pins, steering wheels, a Mercury Sable seat recovered from a salvage yard, a typewriter from the UAW Local 882 office, an old television playing footage from the factory floor. Museum manager Samantha Singleton said it plainly. People don't know the deeper story of how impactful this plant was. She was right. The plant is gone. The building is gone. The Porsche test track runs where the assembly line ran, and the story of what happened here has to be deliberately preserved because nothing about the current landscape tells it. The silver Taurus, the last one, lives in a museum at Chick-fil-A's corporate headquarters in Atlanta. Under its hood and across its trunk, the names of the workers who built it are still there, written in marker on the metal. Truett Cathy, who received that car and who credited Ford workers with giving him the customer base that launched his empire, died in 2014. The car outlasted him. The signatures outlasted the plant. There is a version of this story that presents itself as a straightforward economic narrative. A car company made a series of strategic misjudgments. A plant became uneconomical to maintain. The market moved on. Workers found other work, or they didn't. The land was redeveloped. Life continued. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete in the way that all purely economic accounts of human events are incomplete. They describe what happened without accounting for what was lost in the happening. What was lost in Hapeville was not just jobs. Jobs can be replaced, approximately, eventually, in some form. What was lost was something harder to quantify and harder to rebuild. A specific kind of community organized around a specific kind of skilled work that took decades to develop and disappeared in a single fiscal year's restructuring plan. The workers who built Tauruses in Hapeville had expertise that was genuinely difficult to acquire and genuinely valuable to exercise. They had built that expertise together over years and generations in a shared workplace with a shared culture and a shared understanding of what it meant to do the work well. That community of practice does not survive a plant closure. It disperses and it does not reassemble. The pattern that produced the Hapeville closure is not a historical artifact. It is a recurring structure in American industrial history, and it is worth naming clearly. A company builds something valuable. The thing becomes successful. The company then directs its attention and capital toward whatever is more profitable in the short term, neglecting the thing that was working. The neglected thing deteriorates. The company, rather than investing in reversing the deterioration, closes the facility and absorbs the short-term cost. The workers bear the long-term cost. The company eventually acknowledges the error. Ford's own CEO did exactly this within months of the Hapeville closure. But the acknowledgement comes after the people have already been displaced and the building has already been demolished. Alan Mulally arrived at Ford in September 2006, the month before the last Taurus rolled off the Hapeville line. His first significant public act as CEO was to announce at the Chicago Auto Show in February 2007 that the decision to discontinue the Taurus had been a mistake. The name was being revived. The 500 would be rechristened. Ford had walked away from equity it had spent 20 years building, and it would take years, Mullally's own words, to rebuild what had been thrown away. Ford lost $12.7 billion in 2006. It mortgaged its factories, including its trademark Blue Oval, to raise $23.5 billion in credit just to remain solvent. The company that had thrived on Taurus profits in the early 1990s had driven itself to the edge of bankruptcy in part by abandoning the product and the principles that had rebuilt it. Was it inevitable? The question matters because the patterns are not finished. EV transitions are closing plants today. AI automation is threatening production jobs across manufacturing sectors. Companies are making decisions right now in boardrooms far removed from the factory floor that will determine whether specific communities built around specific kinds of work survive the next decade. The workers at those plants are doing what the workers at Hapeville did, showing up, meeting their targets, delivering quality, and hoping that performance is enough. The lesson of Hapeville suggests it is not always enough. Performance is necessary but not sufficient when the decisions that determine a facility's fate are made on criteria that have nothing to do with what the people inside it are actually doing. The Hapeville plant was the best assembly operation in North America. It was closed anyway. The people who ran that plant had no power over the strategic decisions that sealed its fate. And when those decisions proved to be mistakes, as they were judged to be by the very executives who came after, the workers were long gone. What remains in Hapeville today is a test track for luxury cars, a museum exhibit with workers' uniforms behind glass, a restaurant across the street that outlasted the plant that gave it customers, and a silver Taurus in a private collection with names written inside the lid. The last signatures of a workforce that did everything right and was let go anyway. That is the story of the Ford Atlanta assembly plant. It is not an unusual story. It is in many ways the American manufacturing story of the last half-century, of what was built, what was abandoned, and what it cost the people who built it. The line that once ran here produced 8 million vehicles across 59 years. It produced one generation's American dream, and then another's, and then another's. And then it stopped. Not because it failed, because someone decided it should.